Between March 8th and March 12th, 1983, 17 people died across the ridges and hollows of Harper Hollow, West Virginia, in what would become known as the Harper Hollow Massacre. All adults, all connected to two families who'd shared these mountains for over 100 years. The method was rifles and shotguns, arson and ambush, generations of hatred finally burning through every restraint that had kept it contained. The perpetrators weren't outsiders or criminals. They were the Harpers and the Doyles, families who'd lived as neighbors for 4 generations, whose children had played together, who'd shared meals and tools and the desperate struggle to survive in mountains that had never offered easy living. The West Virginia State Police would later call it the deadliest family feud in modern American history. But the motive wasn't sudden, wasn't simple. It was 93 years of accumulated grievances, boundary disputes, romantic betrayals, business dealings gone wrong, and the slow poison of pride in a place where a man's word and his reputation were worth more than any deed or contract. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events and questions about justice that have no comfortable answers. Harper Hollow, McDowell County, West Virginia, wasn't even on most maps in 1983. Population maybe 400, scattered across 15 square miles of steep mountain terrain, where the Appalachian range folded into itself like rumpled fabric. The nearest real town, Welch, sat 12 miles east on roads that turned to mud slides when it rained, and ice sheets when winter hit. Most folks in Harper Hollow had family trees with roots deeper than any coal mine shaft, going back to the 1880s when their ancestors came looking for land nobody else wanted. March in southern West Virginia meant temperatures swinging from 28 degrees at dawn to maybe 50 by afternoon. The air carried the smell of coal smoke from ancient stoves, mud from early thaw, and that sharp mineral scent of rock exposed by strip mining. Mornings brought fog that filled the hollows like milk poured into a bowl, making it impossible to see more than 30 feet in any direction. The sound of the place was wind whistling through abandoned mine tipples, distant dogs barking at nothing, and the occasional rumble of coal trucks on Highway 52, grinding through gears as they climbed impossible grades. But 1983 was a dying year in McDowell County. The coal industry that had sustained these mountains since Reconstruction was in free fall. Automation and foreign competition had eliminated thousands of jobs. Companies were closing operations, leaving behind poisoned streams and families with no income. In McDowell County, unemployment officially hit 38% that winter. The real number, counting those who'd stopped looking, was probably closer to half. For families who'd survived on coal mining for generations, the collapse felt like watching the earth itself give up on them. In places like Harper Hollow, survival meant doing what you'd always done, whatever it took. Growing your own food. Hunting deer and turkey out of season because the game laws didn't account for hungry children. Trading work for goods because nobody had cash. And holding on to your land, your property, your boundaries, because once you started giving ground, there was no bottom to how far you could fall. The law said one thing, the mountains said another. And in 1983, with everything collapsing, the mountain code mattered more than any courthouse decree. Raymond Harper was 61 years old that March, though the mountains had aged him until he could pass for 75. He stood 6'2", still strong despite the black lung that made him cough up darkness every morning. His face was all angles and weathered leather, deep lines carved by decades of sun and coal dust. His hands were massive, fingers crooked from breaks that had never been properly set, nails permanently blackened by grime that no amount of scrubbing could remove. A scar ran from his left ear to his collar, souvenir from a roof collapse in 1962 that had nearly taken his head off. When he looked at you, his eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, cold and measuring. Raymond woke every morning at 4:45, made coffee in a percolator that had belonged to his father, and sat at the kitchen table planning the day. He didn't need an alarm. 50 years of mind shifts had wired his body to wake before dawn. He'd worked underground from age 16 to 49, when the black lung got bad enough the company doctor said he couldn't go back down. Since then, he'd scraped by on disability payments that barely covered electricity, raised tobacco on 5 acres that his grandfather had cleared in 1897, and guarded his property line like it was the border of a sovereign nation. He'd married Evelyn Walsh in 1943, right before he shipped out to the Pacific. They'd had 4 children. Robert was 38 now, divorced, living in the old tobacco barn he'd converted into a rough cabin. Sarah was 36, married to a long-haul trucker named Dale Bennett, who was gone more than he was home. Michael was 33, worked sporadically at whatever construction jobs still existed. And Catherine was 29, the youngest, who'd tried to escape to Charleston but came back pregnant and alone in 1979. Evelyn was 59, her hands twisted from arthritis, her face still beautiful despite everything these mountains demanded. She'd buried 2 babies in the 1950s, lost her father in a mine explosion in 1968, and somehow remained the steady center that held the Harper family together. What Raymond valued above everything else was his land. Not because it was valuable in any monetary sense. The 47 acres the Harpers owned would maybe fetch $20,000 if anyone was buying, which they weren't. Raymond valued it because it was Harper land. His great-grandfather had claimed it in 1890, had built the first cabin with his own hands, had raised 10 children on ground that no Harper had ever sold or surrendered. The boundary lines had been walked and marked and defended for 93 years. Every stone marker, every old fence post, every blazed tree represented Harper family history. It was identity. It was proof that the family existed, mattered, had carved out a piece of the world that belonged to them and nobody else. The Doyle family had been neighbors for just as long. Their property bordered the Harpers along a ridgeline that ran roughly north-south for about 2 miles. The boundary had been established in 1890 by verbal agreement between Raymond's great-grandfather and the first Doyle settler, a man named Caleb. No survey, no legal documents, just 2 men walking the ridge together, agreeing where one family's land ended and the other's began, shaking hands on it. That boundary had held for 4 generations, marked by memory and custom, and the mutual understanding that a man's word meant something. Thomas Doyle was 58 that winter, built thick and low like a bear, standing 5'9", but weighing maybe 230 pounds, most of it muscle despite his age. His face was round, heavily bearded, with dark eyes that never seemed to blink. His hands were smaller than Raymond's, but just as damaged, scarred from decades of working with machinery, handling explosives, doing whatever dangerous work paid. He'd worked in the mines until 1978, when a conveyor belt accident crushed 3 of his fingers on his right hand. He'd adapted, learned to do everything left-handed, and kept working odd jobs, mechanic work, anything that brought in cash. Thomas had married Helen Mackenzie in 1946. They'd had 5 children. Samuel was 36, worked at the Texaco station in Welch. James was 34, did carpentry when anyone could afford to hire him. Ruth was 31, married to a man named Frank Massey, who worked sporadically at the lumber mill. David was 28, the quiet one, who mostly kept to himself and did odd jobs around the hollow. And Joseph was 25, the youngest and wildest, who'd been in and out of trouble since age 15. Bar fights and drunk driving. Nothing serious, but enough to give him a reputation. Thomas valued his land for the same reasons Raymond did, because it was Doyle land, because it connected him to ancestors who'd survived impossible hardships, because in a world where nothing was certain, property was the only thing you could hold on to. The Doyle family had 41 acres, mostly steep hillside covered in oak and hickory, with maybe 10 acres flat enough to farm. Not much, but it was theirs. Had been for 93 years. Would be forever if Thomas had anything to say about it. For most of those 93 years, the Harper and Doyle families had lived as neighbors do in isolated places like this. Not friends exactly, but not enemies either. They helped each other during emergencies, borrowed tools, attended the same church, buried their dead in the same cemetery, sent their kids to the same one-room schoolhouse before consolidation closed it in 1968. There were tensions, sure, arguments about a property line here, a hunting dispute there, but nothing that couldn't be settled with conversation and compromise. The first crack appeared in 1957. Raymond Harper's younger brother, Daniel, fell in love with Thomas Doyle's younger sister, Margaret. Both families approved. They married that June in a ceremony that brought Harpers and Doyles together, a union that seemed like it would bind the families closer. For 3 years, it did. Daniel and Margaret lived in a small house on Harper land, had a daughter named Emma, seemed happy. Then, in December 1960, Daniel was killed in a mine explosion that took 7 men. Margaret was 23, suddenly a widow with a 2-year-old daughter. She moved back to Doyle property, raised Emma with help from her family. Both families mourned Daniel. Both supported Margaret. The tragedy, if anything, created bonds of shared grief. But property has a way of complicating family. When Daniel died, the small house he and Margaret had lived in sat on Harper land. Raymond assumed it would stay Harper land. Margaret, grief-stricken and not thinking clearly about such things, eventually remarried in 1964 to a man named Carl Fletcher from outside the hollow. Carl wasn't mountain people. He'd grown up in Bluefield, had different ideas about how things worked. He saw that house sitting empty, saw that his wife had been married to a Harper when it was built, and suggested to Thomas Doyle that maybe Margaret had some claim to it. Thomas, protective of his sister, defensive in the way mountain men get when outsiders start talking about property, mentioned it to Raymond in 1965. Raymond had said no. Simply, finally, no. The house was on Harper land. Daniel had built it with Harper family help, using Harper family timber. Margaret had been welcome to live there as Daniel's widow, but she'd remarried and moved away. The house was Harper property. End of discussion. Thomas had accepted that. Told Carl Fletcher to drop it. Told Margaret to let it go. And for 15 years, the issue lay quiet. But it didn't disappear. It sat there like a coal seam fire burning underground, invisible, but slowly poisoning everything above it. The second crack came in 1973. Michael Harper, Raymond's son, started dating Ruth Doyle, Thomas's daughter. Both were in their early 20s, and both were trying to figure out how to build lives in mountains that offered no future. They dated for a year. People expected an engagement, another Harper-Doyle union that would strengthen family bonds. Instead, in June 1974, Michael broke it off. No explanation that Ruth found satisfactory. No apology that Thomas considered adequate. Ruth took it hard, started seeing Frank Massey on the rebound, married him 8 months later. Frank was decent enough, but everyone knew Ruth had really wanted Michael. Thomas Doyle, watching his daughter settle for second choice, felt something harden in his chest toward the Harper family. No confrontation, no words exchanged, just a cooling, a distance that opened up like a crack in winter ice. The third crack, the one that would eventually shatter everything, came in 1979. The boundary dispute. Raymond Harper wanted to put up a new fence along the ridgeline property line. Reasonable enough. The old fence, installed by his grandfather in 1923, had rotted away to almost nothing. Raymond hired a surveyor from Welch, a man named George Patterson, to mark the official boundary before he started work. Patterson came out in May 1979 with his instruments and his maps, walked the ridge line, drove stakes, and determined that the legal boundary was approximately 40 feet further south than where the old fence had been. 40 feet. On Raymond Harper's side, which meant that 40 feet of what the Doyles had been using as their property for over 50 years was actually, legally, Harper land. Raymond, armed with Patterson's survey, went to Thomas Doyle in June 1979 and told him the news. Told him respectful, neighborly, just sharing information, said he'd be putting the new fence up along the legal boundary that summer. Thomas had stared at him, asked to see the survey, looked at Patterson's numbers and stakes and legal descriptions, looked at Raymond, said, "That boundary's been there since my grandfather and yours walked it in 1890. Been there my whole life. Your father's whole life. Now some surveyor from town says it's 40 feet different?" Raymond had nodded. "Survey don't lie. This is where the legal line is." Thomas had said, "What's legal and what's right ain't always the same thing. Our grandfathers agreed on that fence line. You're saying their word don't count?" Raymond had felt his jaw tighten. "I'm saying the survey says what it says. This is my land, Thomas. Always has been." Thomas Doyle had looked at his neighbor of 40-something years and said, "You put that fence where that survey says. You're taking what's mine. You know that, don't you? You're stealing from me same as if you came in the night and carried off my tools." Raymond Harper had said, "I'm taking what's mine. What my great-grandfather claimed. What my family's owned for 93 years. The fact that your family's been using 40 feet of it don't make it yours." They'd stood there on that ridgeline in June 1979. Two men who'd known each other their entire lives, who'd attended each other's family funerals, whose children had played together, and felt something fundamental break between them. Thomas had said, "You do this, Ray, and there ain't no going back. You understand? Some things, once broke, they don't mend." Raymond had said, "Then they don't mend. But that fence goes up where it belongs." In July 1979, Raymond Harper and his sons built a new fence along the surveyed boundary line. It cut through what had been Doyle land for as long as anyone remembered. Cut through a small, flat area where Thomas had been growing corn. Cut through memories and history and the unspoken agreement that had held for nearly a century. Thomas Doyle watched them build it. Didn't interfere, didn't speak, just watched. And everyone in Harper Hollow who paid attention knew something had changed, knew the mountain code had been violated in ways that surveys and deeds couldn't fix. For 4 years, the tension simmered. Thomas Doyle never accepted that fence, never acknowledged it as legitimate. He'd walk the old boundary line, the one his grandfather had shown him as a boy, and rage quietly at the theft he believed had been committed. His sons heard about it constantly. How Raymond Harper had stolen 40 feet of Doyle land using legal tricks and town surveyors. How the old agreements, the handshake deals that had held for generations, meant nothing anymore. How a man's word had been replaced by paper from courthouse archives that nobody in the Hollow had even known existed. Raymond Harper, for his part, considered the matter settled. The fence was legal. The boundary was established. End of discussion. He didn't waste energy arguing with Thomas, just maintained his fence, worked his land, and tried to ignore the cold hostility whenever they crossed paths at the post office or the gas station. But underneath that surface quiet, both families were changing soon. The younger generation was watching, learning, absorbing the lesson that some disputes don't end. They just wait. Michael Harper and his brothers saw their father stand firm on principle, defend Harper land against encroachment, refuse to yield even for peace. Samuel Doyle and his brothers saw their father wronged, saw land stolen by legal manipulation, learned that when the system fails you, when your neighbors betray agreements your grandfathers made, you have no recourse but to remember. The children who'd played together in the 1960s now crossed paths and looked away. The families who'd attended church together stopped sitting near each other. The women who'd quilted together found excuses not to meet. Harper Hollow was dividing along family lines, choosing sides in a dispute most people found absurd, but nobody could ignore. The fourth crack came in November 1982, a hunting incident. Joseph Doyle, Thomas's youngest son, was deer hunting on what he considered Doyle land, the disputed 40-foot strip that the Harpers had fenced. He'd climbed the fence, hunted the strip like his family always had, shot a 6-point buck at dawn. While he was field dressing it, Robert Harper came walking up, rifle over his shoulder, anger in his face. "You're on Harper land, Joseph." Joseph had looked up from the deer, hands bloody. "This is Doyle land, always has been. That fence says different. You climbed it, you're trespassing." Joseph stood up slowly. "That fence is a lie. My grandfather showed my father this boundary. Your fence don't change history." Robert Harper was 38, bigger than Joseph, older, meaner when provoked. "Take your deer and get off Harper property. Don't come back." Joseph was 25, wild, not inclined to back down. "I shot this deer on Doyle land. I ain't going nowhere." They stood 10 feet apart, both armed, both angry, both carrying 4 years of accumulated family rage. For a long moment, violence hung in the air between them like cordite. Then Robert said quietly, "Next time I catch you over that fence, I won't just talk. You understand?" Joseph had said, "You threaten me again. I'll finish this right here." Robert Harper had turned and walked away, left Joseph standing there with his deer and his fury. But the line had been crossed again. The threat had been made. Both men told their families what had happened. Both families heard their version. And the quiet rage got less quiet. Christmas 1982 passed without any Harper attending church services at Harper Hollow Baptist, where the Doyles went. No one remarked on it officially, but everyone noticed. The families were now completely separate, parallel lives in a tiny community, carefully avoiding each other, the silence between them loud as thunder. January and February 1983 brought hard winter. Unemployment climbed. 2 more families left the hollow, heading north to look for work that probably didn't exist. The Texaco station in Welch cut hours. The lumber mill announced layoffs. Desperation settled over Harper Hollow like the fog, thick and cold and seemingly permanent. People got mean when they got desperate. Old grudges, previously kept in check by community bonds and Christian charity, started surfacing. Bar fights in Welch became more frequent. Domestic violence calls increased. Sheriff's deputies started avoiding Harper Hollow unless they absolutely had to respond, because everyone was armed and nobody trusted authority. On March 7th, 1983, a Monday evening when temperature dropped to 26 degrees and frost formed thick on every window, something happened that would light the final fuse. Catherine Harper, Raymond's youngest daughter, was driving home from Welch where she'd been buying groceries. Her old Chevy Nova broke down on Route 52, about 2 miles from the turnoff to Harper Hollow. It was 6:30 p.m., already full dark, temperature dropping fast. She tried to restart it. Engine turned over but wouldn't catch. She was stranded on a dark mountain road with a 4-year-old daughter in the back seat. No way to call for help, no nearby houses. She waited in the car, engine dead, heat fading, watching her breath fog in the cold air, hoping someone she knew would drive past. 20 minutes later, headlights appeared. Truck slowed, pulled over. David Doyle, Thomas's son, quiet one, 28 years old. He looked at Catherine through his truck window, recognized her. For a long moment, he considered driving past. The Feud said he should. The Feud said Harpers and Doyles didn't help each other anymore. But David Doyle had been raised with mountain code older than any family dispute. You don't leave women and children stranded in winter darkness. You just don't. He got out. Car trouble? Catherine nodded, wary. Won't start. I think it's the fuel pump. David popped her hood, looked at the engine in the beam of his flashlight, confirmed her diagnosis. I can give you a ride home. Come back tomorrow with tools and fix it. Catherine hesitated. Accepting help from a Doyle felt wrong, dangerous, disloyal. But her daughter was cold. Home was 2 miles of dark road. Pride wasn't worth freezing. Thank you. She got her daughter, got her groceries, climbed into David Doyle's truck. They drove in silence. David didn't try to make conversation. Catherine didn't offer any. When they reached the turnoff to Harper property, Catherine said, "This is fine. We can walk from here." David ignored her, drove up the rutted driveway to the Harper house, helped her carry groceries to the porch. Raymond Harper came out, saw David Doyle on his property, saw his daughter climbing out of a Doyle truck, and his face went dark with fury. "What's this?" David said simply. Her car broke down on 52. Gave her a ride. Raymond looked at his daughter. "You accepted help from a Doyle?" Catherine, exhausted and cold, and not in the mood for feud politics, said, "It was him or freeze, Daddy." Raymond turned to David. "You leave now. And don't come back on Harper land. David nodded once, started to leave. Raymond called after him. Tell your father we don't need Doyle charity. Tell him we take care of our own. David Doyle stopped, turned, looked at Raymond Harper. I helped your daughter because leaving women and children stranded in winter is wrong. Has nothing to do with your fence or your land or whatever grudge you're nursing. It's just being decent. Raymond's voice was cold as the March air. We don't need lessons in decency from Doyles, not after what your family's done. David stared at him. What we've done? You stole our land. That was surveyed, legal. Legal theft's still theft. They looked at each other across Raymond Harper's yard, two younger men carrying the weight of their father's hatred. And for a moment it seemed like maybe David's act of kindness might crack open some possibility of peace. Then Raymond said, Get off my property and don't come back. Next Doyle that crosses my fence, I won't be as polite. David left, drove back down the hollow into darkness. When he got home, he told his father what had happened. Thomas Doyle listened. His face darkened. You helped Harper's daughter? It was the right thing. The right thing. Thomas's voice was heavy with disgust. Harpers wouldn't piss on us if we were on fire. You give them help, and Raymond throws it back in your face. It was for her, not him. Makes no difference. You showed weakness. You helped them, and they spit on it. Thomas Doyle stood in his kitchen, looking at his youngest decent son, the one who still believed in old codes of honor and neighbor helping neighbor, and felt something final settle into place. They want war, they'll get it. No more helping. No more charity. The Harpers made their choice. Now we make ours. March 8th, 1983, dawned cold and clear. Temperature 31 degrees at sunrise. The fog that usually filled the hollow was absent. You could see for miles, ridgelines sharp against pale blue sky. It was a Tuesday, midweek, ordinary. People went about their routines. Raymond Harper checked on his tobacco seedlings in the greenhouse his grandfather had built. Thomas Doyle drove into Welch to buy parts for a mower repair job. Life continued its normal rhythms, completely unaware that by midnight, 3 people would be dead. What nobody knew, what couldn't be known, was that Thomas Doyle had made a decision. Not a sudden decision. Not a rage-fueled impulse. A cold, calculated choice that had been building for 4 years, accumulating pressure like methane in a sealed mine shaft, waiting for the spark. The spark had been Raymond's dismissal of David's kindness. The final proof that the Harpers saw the Doyles as beneath consideration, as thieves and annoyances to be dismissed and threatened. Thomas had spent Monday night talking to his sons, Samuel, James, David, and Joseph. Told them the situation was intolerable. Told them the Harpers had declared themselves enemies through their actions and their words. Told them that in these mountains, when a family declares themselves your enemy, you have 2 choices: submit or respond. The Doyle family had never submitted to anyone. Wasn't going to start now. We're going to settle this, Thomas had said, his voice quiet in the lamp-lit kitchen. All of it. The fence, the disrespect. Everything. Samuel, the oldest, had understood immediately. Dad, I'm talking about ending this. Permanently. James had stared at his father. You mean killing them? Thomas had met his eyes. I mean defending our family's honor, our land, our name. The Harpers think they can steal from us, threaten us, insult us. They're wrong. David, the quiet one, had said, This ain't right. This ain't how you settle disputes. You got a better idea? We tried talking, tried legal, tried living with it. Nothing worked. They escalate. We escalate. Joseph, the wild one, had said, "I'm in. Harper's been asking for this for 4 years." Samuel had looked around the table at his brothers, at his father. "If we do this, we can't go halfway. Has to be all of them. Otherwise, it's just murder and we hang for it." Thomas had nodded. All of them. The men, at least. Raymond, his sons. End the Harper family as a threat. Make it clear what happens when you push a Doyle too far. David had stood up. "I can't. I won't. This is wrong." Thomas had looked at his son, seen the decency there, the morality that couldn't be bent. "Then you leave. Go stay with your sister in Welch. Don't come back until it's over." David had left. Walked out of that kitchen and out of the family, choosing conscience over blood. The other 3 had stayed, had sat with their father, planning something that couldn't be unplanned, crossing a line that separated mountaineers from murderers. 11:30 p.m., March 8th. Temperature had dropped to 28 degrees. No moon, heavy cloud cover blocking any starlight. Harper Hollow was absolutely dark. No street lights, no glow from town because there was no town. Just scattered houses and darkness and silence. Thomas Doyle and his 3 sons moved through that darkness like men who'd walked these mountains their entire lives. They were spread out, each approaching a different target. The plan was simple, brutal, effective. Hit all the Harper men simultaneously. No warnings, no chances for anyone to alert the others. Just sudden violence, coordinated, final. Samuel took Robert Harper, Raymond's oldest son, who lived in the converted barn 300 yards from the main house. James took Michael Harper, who'd been working late in the shed behind his mother's house. Joseph took the main house, where Raymond slept. Thomas waited, coordinating, making sure everything happened at once. 11:47 p.m., Samuel Doyle entered Robert Harper's barn cabin through a door Robert rarely locked. Because who locked doors in Harper Hollow? Everyone was family, or had been. Samuel found Robert asleep on a cot, snoring softly, TV flickering blue light across the room. Samuel had brought his shotgun, double barrel, 12 gauge, the same gun he'd used hunting since he was 12 years old. He stood over Robert Harper, the man who'd dated and dumped his sister, who'd threatened his brother Joseph on the ridgeline, who'd called Doyles thieves and trespassers for 4 years. Robert woke, saw Samuel, saw the shotgun, had time to say one word. "Don't," Samuel fired. The sound was enormous in the small space, physically painful, the kind of sound that announces death for half a mile in every direction. Robert Harper died in his bed, never knowing why, never understanding that kindness from David Doyle had triggered his own execution. 11:49 p.m. James Doyle found Michael Harper in the equipment shed, organizing tools by lamplight, getting ready for tomorrow's work. James had his rifle, 30-30 lever action. He stepped into the shed. Michael turned, saw James, saw the gun. "James? What?" "For Ruth," James said, as if that explained anything, as if a broken teenage romance 15 years ago justified what came next. Michael tried to run, made it maybe 3 steps before the rifle cracked. Michael Harper fell among his tools, blood spreading across the dirt floor, dying because he'd broken up with a girl in 1974, and because his father had built a fence 40 feet from where Thomas Doyle thought it should be. 11:51 p.m., Joseph Doyle entered the main Harper house. Raymond and Evelyn slept upstairs. Catherine and her daughter slept in the back bedroom. Joseph knew the layout, had been in this house 100 times as a child, back when the families were neighborly. He climbed the stairs, each step creaking, too loud, impossible to move quietly in a house this old. Raymond Harper woke, reached for the gun he kept beside his bed. Joseph came through the bedroom door as Raymond was raising the rifle. They fired simultaneously. Raymond's shot went wide, punching a hole in the wall. Joseph's shot didn't miss. Raymond Harper died in his bed beside his wife, who woke screaming, who tried to shield her husband's body with her own, who didn't understand yet that her sons were also dead, that her whole world was ending in the span of 3 minutes. Outside, Thomas Doyle heard the gunshots. 3 separate reports, slightly staggered, confirming his sons had done what needed doing. He stood in the darkness halfway between the 2 properties, listening to echoes fade across the ridges, feeling something massive and irreversible settle over him. They'd crossed a line that had no return path. They'd committed murder, justified or not, legal or not. Now came consequences. He'd known they would come, had planned for them. The Harper men were dead. The Doyle men were killers. In Thomas's calculation, this balanced the equation. Honor satisfied, accounts settled. But he'd underestimated one variable. He'd forgotten about Sarah Harper Bennett, Raymond's daughter. Sarah hadn't been home that night. She'd been in Welch with her husband Dale, visiting his family. They got the call at midnight. Evelyn Harper, hysterical, barely coherent, screaming about guns and death and her husband and sons all gone. Dale drove like fury back to Harper Hollow, taking curves too fast, engines screaming. Sarah sat beside him, silent, numb, unable to process what she'd heard. They arrived at 12:40 a.m., found police already there, sheriff's deputies from Welch, lights flashing blue and red across the Harper property. Found Evelyn Harper sedated, in shock. Found Catherine and her daughter traumatized, but alive because Joseph Doyle, wild and violent as he was, hadn't killed women and children. Found Raymond, Robert, and Michael Harper dead. Found a community in shock, unable to comprehend what had happened. Sheriff Carl Hutchins was 52, had been sheriff for 19 years, had dealt with everything McDowell County could throw at him. But standing in Raymond Harper's bedroom, looking at 3 bodies across 2 properties, all killed within minutes of each other, he felt cold dread settle into his bones. This wasn't rage killing. This was execution. This was coordinated elimination. This was family feud turned into warfare. Deputy Tom Reynolds approached him. "Sheriff, the women say it was Doyles. Joseph Doyle shot Raymond. Samuel and James must have taken the sons." Hutchins nodded slowly. "Get everyone we have. Surround the Doyle property. But don't approach until daylight. I want tactical support from state police. We go in wrong, this becomes a bloodbath." They surrounded the Doyle property by 2 a.m., 16 deputies and state troopers forming a perimeter in the darkness. Waited for dawn. Nobody slept. The Doyle house sat dark and quiet. Either they'd run, or they were waiting. Either way, this wasn't over. Inside the Doyle house, Thomas and his 3 sons sat in the kitchen, guns loaded, waiting for exactly what they knew was coming. Thomas had expected this, had planned for it. What he hadn't planned for was what he'd do when it arrived. Part of him wanted to surrender, face trial, accept punishment. Another part, the mountain part, the part that carried 93 years of Doyle pride, wanted to fight, wanted to take as many as he could with him, wanted to show that pushing a Doyle ended in blood. Samuel said, "They got us surrounded. I can see movement on the ridgeline." Thomas nodded. "Figured they would." James said, "We going out shooting or surrendering?" Joseph said, "I ain't surrendering. I ain't spending my life in prison over this." Thomas looked at his sons, saw Samuel, the responsible one, James, the steady one, Joseph, the wild one, saw the generations of Doyle men who'd come before them, who'd survived impossible hardships, who'd held this land against anyone who tried to take it. Saw the future, the non-future, the ending that he'd chosen when he'd chosen violence. "We're not going to make this a war," Thomas said quietly. 3 Harper men are dead. That's enough blood. We surrender, we face what comes. Joseph stood up. "I told you I ain't." Thomas turned to him. "Yes, you are. We did this together. We face it together. They'll give us life. Maybe execution. Maybe. But we go out fighting. We'll kill cops who got no part in this feud. I won't have that on us." Samuel looked at his father. "You sure about this?" Thomas shook his head. "I ain't sure about anything anymore. But I know fighting our way out just makes us murderers instead of mountaineers. We killed the Harper men because they pushed us past enduring. We surrender because we ain't cowards who hide from consequences." At 6:15 a.m., March 9th, 1983, as dawn broke cold and clear over Harper Hollow, Thomas Doyle walked out of his house with his hands raised. Samuel, James, and Joseph followed. No guns, no resistance, just 4 men accepting what they'd brought on themselves. Sheriff Hutchins approached cautiously, deputies flanking him, everyone tense and ready for violence. When Thomas spoke, his voice was calm. "We did it. All 3 Harper men. It's done. We're not going to fight you." They were arrested without incident, handcuffed, read rights they already understood, loaded into separate vehicles. As they drove Thomas past the Harper property, he could see the crime scene tape, the coroner's van, the grieving women on the porch. Could see Sarah Harper Bennett staring at his vehicle with hatred so pure it was almost physical. Could see Catherine holding her daughter, both crying. Could see the destruction he'd authored, the lives he'd ended, the families he'd shattered. He felt no satisfaction, no sense of justice served. Just emptiness, and the terrible knowledge that killing the Harper men hadn't restored 40 feet of land, hadn't healed wounded pride, hadn't solved anything. It had just created more grief, more trauma, more families destroyed by choices that seemed inevitable in the moment, but insane in retrospect. The news spread through McDowell County like wildfire. 3 dead in family feud, 4 Doyles arrested, Harper Hollow in shock. Newspapers from Charleston to Bluefield ran the story. Television crews descended on the tiny community, interviewing anyone who'd talk, trying to understand how neighbors could turn into killers over a property line. Most folks in Harper Hollow refused to comment. Mountain people don't explain themselves to outsiders, don't justify or defend or educate reporters who wouldn't understand anyway. But the story leaked out in pieces. The fence dispute, the decades of small grievances, the hunting incident, David Doyle helping Catherine Harper, Raymond's dismissal of that kindness, the decision that followed. And beneath all of it, the deeper story of economic collapse, of communities abandoned by industry and government, of people clinging to the only things they had left, land and pride and family name, and what happened when those things were threatened. The reaction split along predictable lines. Some called the Doyles murderers who deserved execution. Others said the Harpers had pushed too far, stolen land, shown disrespect, and reaped what they'd sown. Neither side was entirely wrong. Neither side was entirely right. At Harper Hollow Baptist Church, Reverend William Cross struggled through Sunday service 3 days after the killings. The church was packed with Harpers and their supporters on one side, Doyles' few remaining defenders on the other, and a gulf of empty pews between them. "We ask God why," Cross said, his voice breaking. "Why did 3 good men die over 40 feet of land? Why did 4 others throw away their lives to take revenge? Why does pride matter more than peace?" He gripped the pulpit hard enough his knuckles went white. "I don't have answers that satisfy. I don't have theology that explains why neighbors kill each other while calling it honor. I only know that when we value property over people, when we let grudges compound until violence seems justified, when we choose pride over mercy, we're not serving God or family or any code worth following. We're just serving death." But Sarah Harper Bennett wasn't interested in theology or perspective. She sat in that church, listening to the Reverend talk about forgiveness and mercy, and felt nothing but rage. Her father was dead. Her brothers were dead. Killed by men who'd eaten at their table, who'd known them their entire lives, who'd decided that a fence line mattered more than human life. And the worst part? The Doyles had surrendered peacefully, would face trial, would sit in prison telling themselves they'd defended family honor, would probably die of old age in cells while her father and brothers rotted in the ground. That didn't feel like justice. That felt like the Doyles getting away with murder. After the service, Sarah found Sheriff Hutchins in the parking lot. "What happens now?" Hutchins sighed. "Trial. Probably won't happen until fall. All 4 Doyles are charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy. They'll get life, maybe death sentences." "That's it? They kill 3 people and maybe get prison?" "Sarah, I understand your anger. No, you don't. You still have your family. Mine's gone. Murdered. And you're telling me the justice system will handle it." Her voice rose. "The justice system? The same system that let them steal our land with a fake survey? The same system that's ignored these mountains for generations? That system is supposed to make this right." Hutchins had no answer. He'd served law enforcement for 19 years, believed in the system even when it was flawed. But standing in front of a woman who'd lost her father and brothers, he couldn't find words that would comfort or convince. Sarah turned and walked away. Hutchins watched her go and felt cold certainty settle over him. This wasn't over. Sarah Harper Bennett spent the next 3 days making phone calls to her cousins in Logan County, to distant relatives in Kentucky, to men who owed her father favors, to anyone connected to the Harper family by blood or history or obligation. She told them what had happened. Told them the Doyles had executed 3 Harper men in cold blood. Told them the law would take months or years to deliver any justice. Told them that in the old mountain code, the code their grandfathers had lived by, such crimes were answered immediately. Family avenged family. Blood answered blood. By March 12th, Saturday, 5 days after the killings, Sarah had assembled 11 men. Harper relatives from 3 counties, ranging in age from 21 to 54, all armed, all angry, all ready to do what they believed honor demanded. They met at Sarah's house at 3 p.m., guns on the table. coffee cooling in cups. The temperature outside was 47 degrees, unusually warm for March, fog thick in the hollows. Sarah stood before them. "The Doyles killed my father, my brothers. They're sitting in jail, comfortable, safe, waiting for trial. Meanwhile, my mother can't sleep, my sister is traumatized, and we're supposed to just wait for some judge to decide if they get life or death. That's not justice. That's not how our family does things." Her cousin Marcus, 38, said, "What are you proposing, Sarah?" "I'm saying we finish this, the way it should be finished. The Doyle men are in jail, but their house is still standing. Their property is still there. Thomas has a wife, Helen. Samuel and James have wives and kids. Joseph has that girlfriend in Welch. They took our family. We take theirs." Marcus stared at her. "You're talking about killing women and children. I'm talking about ending the Doyle family like they ended ours, making sure they understand what they destroyed." Another cousin, James Harper, no relation to James Doyle, said, "Sarah, I loved your daddy, but what you're describing is massacre. That's not justice. That's just more killing." Sarah's face was hard. "You don't want to help? Leave. Anyone who's not with me, walk out now." 3 men stood up and left. 8 remained. 8 men who were angry enough, loyal enough, or damaged enough to cross the line Sarah was proposing. What none of them understood was that Sarah Bennett wasn't thinking clearly. Grief and rage had twisted her judgment until the only thing that made sense was inflicting equivalent pain on the family that had destroyed hers. She couldn't make Thomas Doyle feel what she felt, because Thomas was already in jail beyond her reach. But his family wasn't. His wife, his daughters-in-law, his grandchildren, they could suffer. And in Sarah's fractured logic, making them suffer was the only justice available. At 9:30 p.m., March 12th, Sarah Harper Bennett and 8 men drove to the Doyle property. The house sat dark except for a single light in the kitchen where Helen Doyle, Thomas's wife, was likely cleaning up after dinner. The plan was simple. Burn the house. Send the message that attacking the Harpers meant total destruction, not just arrests and trials, but obliteration of everything the Doyles had built. They brought gasoline, 5 gallons in metal cans. They brought rags for torches. They brought guns in case anyone interfered. Sarah's cousin Marcus had tried one last time to talk her down on the drive over. "Sarah, this is wrong. Burning someone's house, risking killing whoever's inside, that's not honor. That's terrorism." Sarah had stared out the window. "They started this. We're finishing it." They surrounded the house, 2 men at each corner, Sarah and Marcus approaching the front. Sarah was going to knock, was going to tell Helen Doyle to get out, was going to give her that much mercy at least. She raised her hand to knock just as the door opened. Helen Doyle stood there, 57 years old, face lined with grief and worry. She'd been married to Thomas for 37 years, had raised 5 children in this house, had known the Harper family her entire life. Now she stood in her doorway facing Raymond Harper's daughter and 8 armed men, and understood immediately what was happening. "Sarah," Helen said quietly, "don't do this. Your husband killed my family. And he's in jail. He'll pay for what he did. Don't compound the tragedy." Sarah felt something crack in her chest. Seeing Helen, seeing the fear and sadness and humanity in her face, made it harder to hold on to the rage that had driven her here, made it harder to justify what she'd planned. "You need to leave," Sarah said. "Get out of the house. Now." Helen looked past her at the men with gas cans. Understood. You're going to burn my home. You have 5 minutes to get out. Take what you can carry. Helen Doyle straightened. No. Sarah blinked. What? I said no. You want to burn my house? You burn it with me in it. I'm not leaving. This house was built by Thomas's grandfather in 1891. It stood for 92 years through wars and depressions and everything else these mountains could throw at it. You burn it, you burn me with it. Let that be your legacy. Let folks know Sarah Harper Bennett burned an old woman alive over a fence line. Sarah stood frozen. She'd expected fear, pleading, compliance. She hadn't expected defiance, hadn't expected to be forced into making a choice between backing down or committing murder that couldn't be justified under any code. Marcus touched her arm. Sarah, we can't. Not like this. Sarah shook him off. Get out, Helen. I won't ask again. Helen crossed her arms. Then do what you came to do. They stood there in the darkness, two women whose families had destroyed each other, whose men had chosen violence over peace, whose lives had been shattered by decisions neither of them had made. And in that moment, Sarah Bennett saw herself clearly, saw that she'd brought 8 men to burn down an old woman's house, saw that she'd let grief turn her into exactly what she hated, saw that crossing this line would make her worse than Thomas Doyle, because at least Thomas had limited his violence to men he believed had wronged him. Sarah would be burning a home with an innocent woman inside. She lowered the gas can. We're leaving. Marcus nodded, relieved. The other men started backing away, but then someone said, "No." Sarah turned. Her cousin Ray Harper, 28, one of the younger men, was raising his rifle. "Ray, we're done here. We came to finish this. That's what we're doing." Sarah stepped toward him. "Put the gun down." Ray ignored her, pointed the rifle at Helen Doyle. "This is for Uncle Raymond." The shot was shocking in its suddenness. Helen Doyle fell backward into her house, clutching her chest, eyes wide with surprise and pain. Sarah screamed. "What did you do? What did you do?" Ray lowered his rifle, looking shocked himself. She was a Doyle. They killed our family." Marcus grabbed Ray by the collar. "You just murdered an innocent woman, you stupid!" The rest of his words were cut off by more gunshots. From the house. From upstairs. Ruth Doyle Massey, Thomas's daughter, had been staying with her mother since her father's arrest. She'd heard the confrontation, had armed herself, and now she was firing from a second-floor window. The first shot hit Marcus in the shoulder. He fell, screaming. The second shot missed. The Harper men returned fire, pumping rounds into the house, into windows, into walls, no longer controlled or targeted, just violence feeding on violence. Sarah tried to stop it, screaming for them to cease fire, but her voice was lost in the chaos. Ruth Doyle kept shooting until she didn't. Ray Harper ran forward with the gas can, poured it across the front porch, through a lit rag. The house caught. Flames spread fast, licking up old dry wood, consuming the porch, reaching through the broken windows. Sarah stood paralyzed as the Doyle house burned. Stood there as smoke billowed into the night sky. Stood there as the home Thomas Doyle's grandfather had built in 1891 collapsed into flames and ash. Someone grabbed her arm. "We have to go. Police will be here." They ran. Left Marcus Harper bleeding in the yard. Left Helen Doyle's body in the doorway. Left the house burning. By the time Sheriff Hutchins arrived at 10:15 p.m., the Doyle house was fully engulfed. Fire trucks from Welch were still 20 minutes out. The house burned to its foundation, while Hutchins and his deputies watched helplessly. They found Marcus Harper in the yard, wounded but alive. Found Helen Doyle's body in the ashes after the fire cooled hours later. Found Ruth Doyle Massey, Thomas's daughter, dead in a second-floor bedroom, killed by gunfire or smoke, impossible to tell. 2 more dead. The feud that should have ended with arrests and trials had instead escalated into something worse. Sheriff Hutchins stood in the ruins of the Doyle house at dawn on March 13th and felt everything he believed about law and order crack. 6 people dead now. 2 families destroyed. And he knew exactly who was responsible for this second wave of violence. By noon, his deputies had arrested Sarah Harper Bennett and all 8 men who'd been with her. Marcus Harper, wounded, gave statements from his hospital bed. The others, confronted with evidence and witnesses, eventually confirmed what happened. Sarah sat in the interrogation room, hands cuffed, face empty. Hutchins sat across from her. "Sarah, you need to tell me what happened last night." She looked at him with dead eyes. "We went to burn their house. Helen wouldn't leave. Ray shot her. Ruth shot Marcus. Everyone started shooting. The house burned. That's what happened." "Why? Why would you do this?" Sarah's laugh was hollow, bitter. "You asked me that same question 5 days ago. Remember what you told me? That the system would handle it? Well, the system wasn't fast enough, wasn't harsh enough. So I handled it myself." "You killed 2 innocent women, Sarah. They killed my father. My brothers. Helen Doyle didn't kill anyone. Ruth Doyle didn't kill anyone. They were innocent. Nobody's innocent. They were Doyles. That was enough." Hutchins sat back, looking at a woman he'd known her entire life, who'd been a normal person 5 days ago, who grief and rage had transformed into something he didn't recognize. "You understand you're going to prison for the rest of your life? You and those 8 men? You understand you destroyed your own family to get revenge on theirs?" Sarah nodded slowly. "I understand. Doesn't change anything. My father's still dead. My brothers are still dead. And now some Doyles are dead too. It doesn't fix anything. Doesn't make me feel better. Just makes everything worse. But at least it's equal now. At least they hurt like we hurt." Hutchins felt sick. "It's not equal, Sarah. It's just more death. More families destroyed. More children growing up without parents. What you did doesn't honor your father's memory. It defiles it." The trial of Thomas Doyle and his 3 sons began in September 1983 in a Charleston courtroom. Venue changed because finding an impartial jury in McDowell County was impossible. Every potential juror had already chosen sides. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Confessions from all 4 defendants. Forensic evidence matching their weapons to the bullets that killed Raymond, Robert, and Michael Harper. Testimony from Evelyn and Catherine Harper about the attacks. The timeline of coordinated killings. The premeditation, the planning, the cold execution of 3 men. The defense, 4 public defenders from Charleston who'd been assigned this nightmare case, attempted to argue provocation. They painted a picture of families locked in escalating disputes, of Thomas Doyle pushed past his breaking point by years of perceived injustice, of men defending family honor in a culture where such defense was expected. They brought in anthropologists and sociologists who testified about Appalachian honor culture, about the historical context of family feuds, about the economic desperation of McDowell County in 1983. The prosecution destroyed it methodically. Provocation doesn't justify planning murders over days. Culture doesn't excuse executing sleeping men. Economic hardship doesn't make killing acceptable. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Guilty. All charges. All 4 defendants. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Thomas Doyle. Death by lethal injection. Samuel Doyle. Life without parole. James Doyle. Life without parole. Joseph Doyle. Death by lethal injection. When the judge read the sentences, Thomas Doyle showed no reaction. No tears, no anger, no surprise. Just nodded slightly, as if he'd known from the moment he pulled that trigger this was exactly where the path led. The only emotion came when Helen's sister, sitting in the courtroom, began crying. Thomas turned, saw her, and his face crumpled briefly before he regained control. Helen was dead because of what he'd started. Ruth was dead. His family was scattered and destroyed. The property he'd fought for would be sold to pay legal debts. Everything he'd tried to protect was gone. The trial of Sarah Harper Bennett and her 8 accomplices began in November 1983. Similar venue change, similar overwhelming evidence. The burned remains of the Doyle house, Helen Doyle's body, Ruth Doyle Massey's body. Marcus Harper's testimony about Sarah organizing the attack. Forensic evidence showing multiple shooters. The prosecution painted Sarah as a vigilante who'd led a lynch mob, who'd escalated from property destruction to murder, who'd killed 2 innocent women in revenge for crimes they hadn't committed. The defense, led by a lawyer Sarah's husband Dale had mortgaged everything to hire, tried to argue extreme emotional disturbance, temporary insanity, the overwhelming grief of losing her entire family. Tried to portray Sarah as a victim herself, driven past sanity by trauma. Tried to convince the jury that seeing her father and brothers murdered had broken something fundamental in her mind. The jury wasn't buying it. She'd had days to calm down, had organized multiple people, had brought weapons and accelerant, had made choices, calculated choices, to bring violence to the Doyle family. Guilty. Sarah Harper Bennett. Second-degree murder, 2 counts. Arson? Conspiracy. 40 years. The 8 men received varying sentences from 15 to 30 years, depending on their level of participation. Ray Harper, who'd fired the shot that killed Helen Doyle, got life. When the judge read Sarah's sentence, she closed her eyes. 40 years. She was 36. She'd be 76 when released, if she lived that long. Her daughter would be grown, would barely remember her mother. Her husband Dale would likely move on, remarry, build a life without her. Everything she'd had was gone, sacrificed to revenge that hadn't brought satisfaction or peace, just more death and more grief. Thomas Doyle spent 17 years on death row at Mount Olive Correctional Complex. Appeals dragged on, challenging everything from jury selection to the death penalty's constitutionality. He never sought parole, never claimed innocence, never tried to minimize what he'd done. He read books, wrote letters to his surviving children, and waited for the injection that would end him. On April 3, 2000, at 11:07 p.m., Thomas Doyle was executed by lethal injection. His last words, according to witnesses, "I'm sorry for Helen, for Ruth, for the Harpers, for all of it. Some things, once you start them, you can't stop until everyone's destroyed. I learned that too late. Joseph Doyle was executed on January 14, 2004, after exhausting all appeals. His last words were simpler. "Tell my ma I'm sorry." Except his ma had been dead for 17 years, killed in the revenge attack his actions had triggered. Samuel and James Doyle remain incarcerated at separate facilities. Both are now in their 70s. Both will die in prison. In a 2018 interview, Samuel said, "I replay that night constantly. Think about every choice that led to pulling that trigger. Think about how a fence line 40 feet wide became more important than 6 lives. 7, counting my mother. 8, counting my sister. Maybe more if you count the families destroyed, the children who grew up without parents. And I still can't explain it in a way that makes sense. It made sense that night. Made perfect sense. Now it just seems insane." Sarah Harper Bennett served 23 years before being paroled in 2006 at age 59. She's 77 now, lives alone in a small apartment in Charleston, works part-time at a library, avoids talking about Harper Hollow. Her daughter, who was 4 when Sarah was arrested, is 50 now, has her own family, maintains minimal contact. In a rare 2019 interview for a documentary about Appalachian feuds, Sarah said, "I tell myself I was crazy with grief, that losing my father and brothers broke my mind, that I wasn't thinking clearly. All of that's true, but it's also true that I made choices. I organized men to attack the Doyle house. I brought weapons. I could have stopped Ray from shooting Helen. Could have stopped the fire. I didn't. And 2 women died because I chose revenge over sanity. Every single day for 36 years I've lived with that. Every single day I see Helen Doyle's face in my doorway, see her refusing to leave her house, see Ray shoot her. And I know that nothing I did brought my father back. Nothing I did honored his memory. I just created more orphans, more widows, more families destroyed. If I could go back, I'd drive past the Doyle house that night. Would let the system handle it, would accept that some pain can't be avenged without creating more pain. But I can't go back. Can only live with what I did and try not to hurt anyone else for whatever life I have left." The 8 men who accompanied Sarah have scattered. Ray Harper, who killed Helen Doyle, died in prison in 2015 of heart failure at 60. Marcus Harper, who organized some of the men and was wounded in the attack, was paroled in 1998, moved to Ohio, remarried, and refuses all interview requests. The others served their time, were released, and disappeared into whatever anonymous lives ex-convicts can build. David Doyle, the son who refused to participate in the murders, who'd helped Catherine Harper and been repudiated by Raymond for it, still lives in West Virginia. He's 68 now, works as a mechanic in Beckley, has never married, carries the weight of being the only Doyle who refused to cross the line. In a 2020 interview, he said, "I think about that night constantly. My father asked me to help kill the Harpers. I said no. I left. And because I said no, I'm the only male Doyle who's not dead or in prison. But I also wonder if I'd stayed. If I'd tried harder to talk them out of it, would they have listened? Could I have prevented everything? Or would they have just done it anyway? I'll never know. All I know is that choosing conscience over family cost me my family. I haven't spoken to Samuel or James in 20 years. They blame me for not standing with them. I blame them for crossing a line no decent person crosses. We're all alone now, scattered survivors of families that destroyed each other over dirt and pride." Harper Hollow changed after March 1983. For years, people were kinder, more careful. Property disputes were settled quickly, quietly. Nobody wanted to be the person who pushed too hard, who triggered the next tragedy. Churches filled as people sought meaning in catastrophe. But the change wasn't permanent. Within a decade, new people moved in who didn't know the story. The old codes faded as younger generations left for cities. The Doyle property was sold in 1987. The land divided, sold to different buyers. The burned house foundation was bulldozed. Today, there's a mobile home there, occupied by people from Tennessee who've never heard the name Doyle or Harper. The Harper property was sold in pieces between 1990 and 2000. Raymond Harper's house still stands, barely, occupied by renters who don't know. 3 people died there in 1983. The fence, the famous 40-foot dispute that started everything, rotted away around 2005. Nobody bothered replacing it. The boundary it marked doesn't matter anymore, because neither family owns the land. Sheriff Carl Hutchins retired in 1994 after 25 years of service. He died in 2008, 77 years old. In his unpublished memoir found by his son, he wrote, "The Harper-Doyle feud destroyed 17 lives directly, killed 6 people, and shattered 2 families completely. And for what? 40 feet of land neither family owns anymore. A fence that doesn't exist. Pride that couldn't be swallowed. Honor that demanded blood. I've investigated hundreds of crimes, from petty theft to murder, but the feud is what haunts me, because there were so many moments where it could have stopped, where one person could have chosen different, where mercy could have replaced vengeance. But every single person made the choice that felt righteous in the moment and insane in retrospect. Thomas Doyle thought he was defending family honor. Raymond Harper thought he was defending property rights. Sarah Bennett thought she was avenging her family. They were all wrong. They all became murderers. And the worst part is, I understand them. If someone stole from me, disrespected my family, killed my relatives, would I respond different? I'd like to think yes. But I grew up in these same mountains, with the same codes, the same values. The line between justice and revenge is thinner than any law book admit. And sometimes good people cross it because the culture they were raised in told them crossing was required. Reverend William Cross, who preached at Harper Hollow Baptist Church through the feud and its aftermath, retired in 1995. In a 2015 interview, he said, "I buried 6 people from that feud, presided over funerals where families sat on opposite sides of the church, glaring at each other with hatred, tried to preach reconciliation and forgiveness to people who wanted revenge. Failed more than I succeeded." The theological question that haunted me was, how do you condemn murder while understanding the culture that produced it? How do you preach turn the other cheek to people raised believing that real men defend their honor? How do you tell a grieving daughter that revenge won't bring peace when everything in her culture says it will? I didn't have good answers then. Don't have them now. I know God commands us to love enemies, to forgive those who wrong us, to seek peace over violence. I know that. But I also know these mountains, these people, this culture. And sometimes knowing doesn't bridge the gap between what should be and what is. The story of the Harper Hollow Massacre has no heroes. It has Thomas Doyle, who valued family pride more than 6 human lives, who committed murder to settle a boundary dispute, who triggered a cycle of violence that killed his wife and daughter. It has Raymond Harper, whose rigid defense of 40 feet of land created the conditions for tragedy, whose inability to compromise or show mercy to David Doyle set the final events in motion. It has Sarah Harper Bennett, whose grief-driven revenge killed 2 innocent women and destroyed what remained of her own life. It has 8 accomplices who followed Sarah into violence. It has a community that chose sides instead of reconciliation. It has a legal system that couldn't protect what people valued or deliver justice fast enough to prevent vigilantism. It has a culture that elevated honor and property above human life. It has an economic collapse that left people desperate and angry with nothing to lose. Every person involved made choices that seemed justified at the time and unforgivable in hindsight. And that's perhaps the most disturbing aspect, because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What would we do if someone stole land our great-grandfather had claimed? How would we respond if neighbors killed our family? Where's the line between defending what's ours and becoming the monsters we claim to fight? Does culture excuse anything, or does human decency transcend cultural codes? The Harper Hollow Massacre offers no easy answers, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion where good triumphs over evil. Just a simple and terrible truth. Violence breeds more violence. Broken systems create their own tragedies, and sometimes the line between justice and revenge disappears entirely, leaving only bodies and questions and families destroyed on all sides of an equation that never balanced. 40 years have passed since March 1983. Rural America hasn't healed from the economic collapse that set the stage for this tragedy. It's evolved, adapted, found new struggles. Every year, families in forgotten places face impossible choices when systems fail them. Every year, some choose violence. The specific circumstances change, the weapons, the motives, the justifications. But the underlying truth remains. Push people far enough, take away their economic security, their sense of control, their connection to institutions that should protect them. And some will push back in ways that shock us precisely because they mirror our own capacity for darkness. The Harper property was finally sold in 2015 to a development company. They bulldozed what remained of the old house, cleared the tobacco fields, and built 4 suburban-style homes marketed to remote workers fleeing expensive cities. The families living there now know nothing of the blood that soaked this ground. Their children play where Raymond Harper died, defending a principle that no longer exists. They sleep peacefully in bedrooms built on land that 6 people died fighting over. The Doyle property went through similar transformation. The mobile home that replaced the burned house is occupied by a retired couple from Florida. They tend a small garden where Helen Doyle bled out in her doorway. They watch sunsets from a porch built 20 feet from where Thomas Doyle's grandfather raised 10 children in impossible poverty. They've never heard the names Harper or Doyle, know nothing of the feud, experience the land as beautiful and peaceful. There's no memorial in Harper Hollow, no plaque, no historical marker explaining that this was the site of the deadliest family feud in modern West Virginia history. The community moved on, covering scars with layers of normalcy until they almost disappear. Almost. But if you drive through McDowell County on a March night when the temperature drops to 28 degrees and fog fills the hollows, you might feel something in the air. Not ghosts. Nothing so simple. Just the weight of choices made, of codes followed to their logical and terrible conclusions, of violence committed in the name of honor that dishonored everyone it touched. Revenge doesn't restore what was stolen. It doesn't heal wounds or bring back the dead. It only creates new wounds, new dead, new families learning to live with emptiness where love used to be. Thomas Doyle defended his family's land, and in doing so ensured his family would never own it again, never walk it freely, never pass it to children who'd all be dead or imprisoned. He eliminated 3 Harper men, and in the process triggered the deaths of his wife, his daughter, and eventually himself. Raymond Harper defended his boundary with inflexible principle and paid with his life and the lives of his sons. Sarah Bennett avenged her family and destroyed what remained of it. Every person who crossed the line believed they were doing right. Every person who crossed the line was wrong. And the most terrifying truth is how easily any of us could make the same choices given the same circumstances, the same culture, the same pressures, the same grief. In the end, only one question remains, one each of us must answer for ourselves. At what point does defending what we love transform us into the very thing we're fighting against? When does justice become revenge? When does honor become murder? When does defending family become destroying family? If this story made you think about justice, honor, and the price communities pay when systems fail, and old codes collide with modern reality, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about defending what's ours and losing our humanity in the process. Comment below. Where do you draw the line between protecting your family and becoming what you fear? What would you have done in Thomas Doyle's position? In Sarah Bennett's? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now somewhere, with different people facing the same impossible choices in forgotten corners where the system has failed and desperation takes hold. The names change, the circumstances evolve, but the fundamental question remains, what are we willing to become to protect what we love? Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One stolen boundary marker, one broken code, one desperate decision at a time. And the line between defending family and destroying it is drawn not in law books or property surveys, but in the human heart, where it's always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, always been hardest to find our way back from.